I was unnecessary in my father's plans. He sacrificed $250,000 for his friend's son. His decisions turned into a disaster. I learned the truth, and then, my name Olivia, and growing up, I had always been the ambitious one in my family. I worked hard, pushing myself to excel in school so I could achieve my dream of attending a prestigious university. For me, that dream had always been Stanford. Ever since I was a kid, I'd envisioned myself walking through its iconic campus, pursuing the education I had worked so hard for. My dad, James, was always supportive, until things changed during my senior year of high school. We were close, and I trusted him. He had always pushed me to aim high, telling me that nothing was out of reach if I worked for it. I took his advice to heart and devoted myself to making sure my college applications were flawless. But as it turned out, that support only went so far when it came to Mason, my dad's childhood best friend's son. Mason had never been particularly academic. He was the kind of guy who coasted through high school, relying on charm and his parents' money to get by. He didn't care about grades or extracurriculars, but somehow he always landed on his feet. It was frustrating watching him get away with things, but it wasn't my problem, until my dad decided it was. Mason's dad, Lucas, had been friends with my dad since forever. They had grown up together, and my dad always talked about how Lucas had helped him out when they were younger. I always sensed that my dad felt like he owed Lucas something. Maybe that was why he was so invested in Mason's future, but it never made sense to me. Why was my dad so focused on Mason when I was right here, trying to secure my own future? It started small. Mason would come over to the house sometimes, and my dad would talk about how he was struggling with his college applications. Mason was aiming for the same schools as me, Stanford, UCLA, USC, but his grades were nowhere near competitive. I figured he'd apply and get rejected. That's just how it worked. You couldn't half-ass your way into schools like that. Then, out of nowhere, my dad came to me with a strange request. He sat me down one evening and said, "Olivia, I know you've been working hard on your college applications, and I'm so proud of you. But Mason could use some help." I blinked, confused. Help? Like what? "Mason's applications aren't as strong as yours," my dad continued, his tone cautious. "His essay, in particular, it's not great. I was wondering if you could give him some pointers." I frowned. I had spent weeks refining my own essays, making sure every word was perfect. Now, my dad was asking me to help Mason with his? Dad, I barely have time to worry about my own stuff. And besides, Mason doesn't care about school the way I do. He didn't even take it seriously until now. "I know," my dad said quickly, "but Lucas has been going through some tough times, and it would mean a lot to him if Mason could get into a good school. Just give him some advice. You don't have to write it for him." I felt a pang of guilt. My dad was always talking about loyalty and helping those who helped us, but this felt different. It felt unfair. Still, I agreed. "Fine, I'll look it over." That should have been the end of it. But as it turned out, my dad's involvement in Mason's future went much deeper than just asking for advice on an essay. A few weeks later, I submitted my Stanford application. It had taken months of hard work, and I felt confident about it. The admissions process was brutal, but I knew I had a shot. I had the grades, the extracurriculars, and a strong essay. It was in Stanford's hands now. Then, one afternoon, I came home from school to find my dad on the phone with Lucas. I overheard bits of the conversation as I walked into the living room. My dad was saying something about pulling strings and connections, and my stomach dropped. I waited until he hung up and then asked, "What was that about?" My dad looked startled, but then he forced a smile. "Oh, nothing you need to worry about, Olivia. Just trying to help Lucas out." "Help him with what?" I pressed, already feeling uneasy. My dad hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mason's struggling to get into any of his schools, and Lucas is desperate. We're trying to see if we can find someone who can help, smooth the process." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're trying to buy his way into college?" "Not exactly," my dad said defensively. "It's not like that. We're just exploring options." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Dad, that's not fair. I've worked my ass off to get into Stanford, and Mason has done nothing. Why should he get in just because you're exploring options for him?" My dad sighed, rubbing his temples. Olivia, life isn't always fair. Mason's like family to us, and sometimes you have to help family, even when it doesn't seem fair. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Family? Mason wasn't family. He was just Lucas's son, a guy who hadn't cared about his future until it was too late. And now, my dad was going to throw money or favors at the problem to solve it for him? It made me sick to my stomach. It wasn't until weeks later that I realized just how far my dad was willing to go for Mason. The day the Stanford acceptance letters were released was supposed to be one of the most exciting moments of my life. I had been waiting for this day for months. I rushed home from school, my heart pounding as I logged into the admissions portal, ready to see the results. I got in. Stanford had accepted me, and for a brief moment, I was over the moon. All my hard work had paid off. I felt like I was on top of the world. But then I heard my dad on the phone again. He was talking to Lucas, and from what I overheard, Mason had gotten in too. It didn't make sense. Mason's grades weren't good enough. His extracurriculars were practically non-existent. There was no way he could have gotten into Stanford on his own merit. And that's when it hit me. My dad had done more than just explore options. He had pulled strings, called in favors, maybe even made a donation to secure Mason a spot. Suddenly, my acceptance didn't feel like a victory anymore. It felt tainted. The thought that my dad had undermined everything I had worked for, that Mason had gotten in because of some backroom deal, filled me with rage. That night, I confronted my dad. I demanded to know the truth, and after some back and forth, he finally admitted it. I had to do something, Olivia, he said, his voice strained. Mason wasn't going to make it on his own, and Lucas needed me. You were always going to be fine. But Mason, he needed a break. I needed a break. I shouted, my voice shaking with anger. You think just because I've worked hard that it's okay for you to give away what I've earned? How could you do this to me? My dad looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you'd understand, but I didn't. And in that moment, I realized things between us would never be the same. In the months that followed, I tried to focus on preparing for Stanford, but the bitterness ate away at me. It became harder to feel excited about attending the school when I knew that Mason had gotten there through manipulation. Eventually, as my acceptance to other schools came in, I made a decision that shocked even me. I declined Stanford's offer. I didn't want to go somewhere that felt tainted by my father's betrayal. Instead, I accepted a spot at a top state school. My dad was furious when I told him, but I didn't care. I was done being his pawn in this twisted loyalty game. I threw myself into my studies and eventually my career, determined to prove that I could succeed without the shady deals and strings attached. And Mason? Well, he went to Stanford, but that's a whole other story. After I turned down Stanford and enrolled at a state school, I tried my best to focus on my new life. I had gotten a scholarship, the classes were great, and I quickly found a circle of friends who made the transition easier. But even though I wasn't at Stanford, I couldn't fully escape the weight of what had happened. My dad was still angry with me for not taking the offer, and our relationship had never fully recovered. Meanwhile, Mason went off to Stanford as planned. It hurt knowing that he was living the life I had worked so hard for, but I tried not to think about it. I figured I would never hear from him again, that our lives would finally go in different directions. But, as fate would have it, that wasn't the case. In our second year of college, I started hearing things about Mason. We weren't in contact, but word traveled back through my dad and the occasional conversations he had with Lucas. Apparently, Mason wasn't thriving at Stanford the way my dad had hoped he would. He wasn't excelling academically, nor was he making the connections my dad and Lucas had banked on. In fact, it sounded like he was barely keeping his head above water. And then, Mason got involved with something new, cryptocurrency. It started innocently enough, or so my dad told me one evening over dinner. We were barely speaking at that point, but occasionally we would exchange pleasantries about school and life. That night, he mentioned that Lucas was excited because Mason had gotten into the latest craze, cryptocurrency. Mason had been reading up on it, watching videos, and even investing his own money into it. I think this could be a good thing for him, my dad said, sounding optimistic for the first time in a long while. He's never been great with academics, but this could be his ticket to making something of himself. I shrugged, not caring much either way. I didn't know much about cryptocurrency, but the idea that Mason was gambling with it didn't surprise me. He had never been the type to work hard for what he wanted. He always looked for shortcuts. And now, it seemed like he had found one. A few months later, I found out that Mason wasn't just dabbling in crypto. He was fully immersed in it. Lucas and my dad kept talking about how Mason had started his own portfolio and how he was doing well. My dad even mentioned that Mason had convinced Lucas to invest in some coins alongside him, saying it would be a quick way to make money. I couldn't help but roll my eyes at the whole thing. Sure, some people had made a fortune off cryptocurrency, but it always felt like gambling to me. It was volatile, unpredictable, and knowing Mason's history with responsibility, I had a bad feeling about it. But I kept my mouth shut. If my dad wanted to believe in Mason, that was his problem, not mine. Then, everything escalated. By the time we were both in our third year of college, Mason had completely lost control. What had started as a hobby had become an obsession. He was sinking more and more money into cryptocurrencies, staying up all night monitoring the markets, and barely focusing on his schoolwork. I only knew this because my dad had started talking to me about it again, worried but still oddly hopeful. Mason's on the verge of something big, he'd say over the phone, trying to convince me as much as himself. He's just riding out some volatility in the market. Once things stabilize, he'll be fine. He's just going through a rough patch. But that rough patch turned into a full-blown disaster. It started with a crash. One night, the value of Mason's investments plummeted. One of the cryptocurrencies he'd put a significant chunk of money into completely tanked, wiping out a large portion of his portfolio. Mason, in a panic, tried to salvage what was left by moving his remaining funds into riskier and riskier coins, hoping for a quick rebound. But instead of recovering, things spiraled further out of control. By the time it was all said and done, Mason had lost everything. When I say everything, I mean everything. He hadn't just lost his own money, he had burned through Lucas's investments too. Lucas had trusted Mason's judgment, pouring a significant amount of the family's savings into his son's crypto empire, only for it to evaporate in a matter of weeks. And the kicker? My dad had been involved too. I found out when I overheard my parents arguing late one night. I had come home from school for the weekend, and my dad was pacing the living room while my mom sat on the couch, her face pale and drawn. "You put money in with Mason?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Our savings, James? How could you do that without telling me?" "I thought it was a sure thing," my dad said, rubbing his temples in frustration. "Lucas and I both thought Mason knew what he was doing. It was going well for a while, and then everything crashed." My blood ran cold. I had assumed my dad had kept his distance from Mason's crypto scheme, but now it was clear that he had been involved all along. He hadn't just sacrificed my future for Mason's college spot. He had bet our family's financial security on Mason's reckless investments. I couldn't listen anymore. I stormed into the living room, barely able to contain my anger. "You invested with Mason?" I spat, glaring at my dad. "After everything he's done? After what you did to me?" My dad's face fell, and he looked at me with a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. I thought it would work out, Olivia. Mason was making money, and I wanted to help him succeed." "Help him succeed?" I snapped. "You've been helping him since the beginning, and all he's done is fail. First you gave him my Stanford spot, and now you've let him ruin everything else. When are you going to realize that Mason isn't worth it?" The room went silent. My dad looked down at his hands, and for the first time, I saw how worn down he truly was. He wasn't the strong, confident man I had grown up with. He was a man who had made mistake after mistake, all because he couldn't see that Mason wasn't his responsibility to fix. "Mason's lost everything," my dad finally said, his voice quiet. "Lucas is on the verge of bankruptcy. And we're not far behind." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He sighed heavily. "We took out a loan to invest more money into Mason's portfolio when it was doing well. But now that it's gone, we're on the hook for that loan. If we don't find a way to pay it back soon, we could lose the house." I stared at him, too stunned to speak. This was worse than I had imagined. My dad hadn't just risked our savings. He had put our entire future on the line for Mason's reckless gamble. "Unbelievable," I muttered, shaking my head in disbelief. You've destroyed everything for him. I hope it was worth it." Without waiting for a response, I turned and left the room. I couldn't be around my dad anymore. His obsession with Mason had cost us everything, and I wasn't going to stick around to watch the rest of our lives fall apart. After the confrontation with my dad, I knew I had to get out of that house. I couldn't stand being around him anymore, not when everything we had worked for was on the verge of collapse because of Mason's reckless decisions. The fact that my dad had not only sacrificed my dream of going to Stanford, but also risked our financial future was too much to bear. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into my studies. School had always been my escape, and now more than ever, I needed something to focus on. I knew that if I was going to survive this mess, I needed to secure my own future without relying on my family. By the time I graduated, I had already lined up a job in marketing at a tech startup. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't what I had imagined for myself when I first dreamed of going to Stanford, but it was a start. More than that, it was my way of taking control of my life, of making sure that I didn't end up like my dad, constantly chasing after other people's dreams, trying to help them while losing everything in the process. I distanced myself from my family. My mom called often, and I knew she was struggling to keep things together, but I didn't have the emotional energy to deal with it. I had to prioritize myself for once, and that meant focusing on my career and cutting ties with the toxic dynamics at home. I didn't hear much from my dad in those months, but I knew things weren't getting better. Every so often, I'd get an update through my mom about how they were scrambling to find ways to cover the massive debt my dad had racked up from his ill-fated investment with Mason. The exact number still haunted me, $250,000. That's how much my dad had poured into Mason's cryptocurrency scheme. Half of it had been borrowed, $125,000 in a loan my dad took out with the house as collateral. The other half had come from what little savings they had left. I couldn't even wrap my head around it. To me, it was just another reminder of how deep my dad's blind faith in Mason went, and how it had left my family financially ruined. Meanwhile, Mason had disappeared. After the crash, he cut off contact with my dad and Lucas, probably too ashamed or afraid to face the consequences of his failure. No one knew where he was or what he was doing. Part of me wondered if he had run away, or if he was still trying to claw his way back into the cryptocurrency world, but I tried not to think about it. Mason had always been a reckless opportunist, and I couldn't waste any more energy on him. Instead, I focused on my own path. My job at the startup kept me busy, and over the next year, I worked my way up the ladder, gaining experience and proving my worth. I stayed late at the office, volunteered for projects that no one else wanted to touch, and slowly but surely, I carved out a place for myself in the company. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I questioned whether it was all worth it. But at least I was doing something that was mine, something that I had earned without anyone else's interference. That didn't mean the bitterness went away, though. Every now and then, the memories of what my dad had done would creep back in. I'd think about how different my life could have been if he hadn't thrown everything away for Mason. I could have been at Stanford, building connections with future leaders and innovators, setting myself up for a future that would have aligned with my dreams. Instead, I was grinding away at a mid-level marketing job, trying to make the best of a situation I had never asked for. But despite the lingering resentment, I knew I had to keep moving forward. I couldn't change what had happened, and I couldn't waste any more time dwelling on it. My career became my top priority, and as I continued to climb the corporate ladder, I started to feel like I was finally in control of my life again. Still, the damage had been done, and the fallout from Mason's disaster wasn't going away anytime soon. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I got a call from my mom. I hadn't spoken to her much since I left home, but she still called occasionally to check in. This time, her voice sounded strained, and I could tell right away that something was wrong. "Olivia," she said, her voice cracking. "It's about your dad." I closed my eyes, bracing myself. "What is it?" They're going to foreclose on the house." My stomach twisted. I had known it was coming, but hearing the words still hit me like a punch to the gut. "They're giving us a month to move out," she continued, her voice shaky. "Your dad tried to negotiate, but there's no more time. We can't pay back the loan. It's over." I felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over me. My childhood home, The place where I had grown up, where I had once felt safe and secure, was going to be taken away. And all because my dad had put his faith in Mason, in a reckless cryptocurrency scheme that had been doomed from the start. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said quietly, not sure what else to say. "I wish I could help." "I know, sweetheart," she replied, her voice thick with tears. "It's not your fault. You've done more than enough by staying out of all this. You're doing the right thing by focusing on yourself." But even though I knew she was right, it still felt like everything was crumbling around me. I had distanced myself from the chaos, but the damage was still rippling through our lives, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I hung up the phone, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that I had escaped before everything came crashing down, and sadness for what my family had lost. My dad's obsession with helping Mason had cost him everything, and now there was no going back. As the weeks passed, I poured even more of myself into my career, determined to build something that couldn't be taken away from me. I worked hard, landed a promotion, and started thinking about the future. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control over my own destiny. But even as I moved forward, I knew that the scars from my dad's betrayal would never fully heal. And Mason? Well, I hadn't heard from him in over a year, but I knew that eventually he'd have to face the consequences of his actions. I just hoped that when the time came, it would be enough. After my mom's call about the foreclosure, I did what I had always done. I pushed it to the back of my mind and focused on my career. My parents' financial collapse wasn't my responsibility, and I had spent enough of my life dealing with the consequences of their poor decisions. I had worked hard to separate myself from the mess they had created, and I wasn't about to let their mistakes drag me down. In the year following that phone call, my career took off. I had been working at the tech startup for 3 years, and all the long hours, extra projects, and sacrifices were finally paying off. I got promoted to a management position, overseeing a small team. My salary increased, and for the first time in my life, I was financially comfortable. I even started thinking about buying my own apartment. It felt like I was finally in control of my future, and I wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, get in the way of that. My parents, on the other hand, were spiraling. After losing the house, they were forced to move into cheap motels, barely scraping by. My mom kept working part-time, doing what she could to bring in money, but it wasn't enough to keep them afloat. My dad had sunk so much of their savings into Mason's cryptocurrency disaster that they had nothing left. And now, with the loan hanging over their heads, it was only a matter of time before they hit rock bottom. I knew they were struggling, but I kept my distance. I wasn't heartless. I still loved my mom, and part of me even felt sorry for my dad. But I had learned the hard way that getting involved in their problems would only end in more disappointment and frustration. I had made my decision to focus on myself, and I wasn't going to let their chaos drag me back in. Then, one day, everything came to a head. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was at my apartment, catching up on some work when my phone rang. I saw my dad's name flash on the screen and hesitated for a moment before answering. We hadn't spoken much since I left home, and when we did, it was usually brief and awkward. But something told me this call was different. "Hello?" I answered, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Olivia." My dad's voice was sharp, more aggressive than usual. "We need to talk." I braced myself. "About what?" "About everything. About the fact that you're living in your nice apartment, with your cushy job, while your mother and I are stuck living in motels, barely able to make ends meet." I clenched my jaw, feeling the familiar surge of anger rise up inside me. I knew where this was going, and I wasn't in the mood for another guilt trip. "I've worked hard to get where I am, Dad," I said, my voice tight. "It's not my fault you and Mom are in this situation." My dad scoffed. "Not your fault? We sacrificed everything for you, Olivia. We put a roof over your head, paid for your education, raised you. And this is how you repay us? By turning your back on us when we need you the most?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad was seriously trying to pin their financial disaster on me, as if I had somehow caused it. "You didn't sacrifice everything for me," I shot back, my voice shaking with anger. "You sacrificed my future for Mason. You gambled away our savings, our house, for his stupid crypto scheme. And now you want me to bail you out? After everything you've done? My dad was silent for a moment, and then his voice turned cold. We raised you, Olivia. We gave you everything you have. And now that you're successful, you owe us. You owe us for everything we did for you. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. I had always known my dad was manipulative, but hearing him say those words out loud was like a slap in the face. I don't owe you anything, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. You're my father, and yes, you raised me. But that doesn't give you the right to demand money from me. Especially not after everything you've done to ruin our family. You ungrateful little, my dad started, but I cut him off. I'm not giving you money, Dad, I said firmly. I worked for everything I have, and I'm not going to let you take that away from me. You made your choices. You chose to invest in Mason, to throw our savings away on some get-rich-quick scheme. And now you have to live with the consequences. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought my dad had hung up. But then, I heard him take a deep breath. You're making a big mistake, Olivia, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You think you're better than us now, don't you? You think just because you've got a job and some money, you can just turn your back on your family? I'm not turning my back on Mom, I replied, my voice calm. I'll help her if she needs it. But you? You're on your own. With that, I hung up the phone, my heart racing. I couldn't believe I had actually said it, that I had finally drawn the line and refused to let my dad manipulate me any longer. It was terrifying, but it also felt freeing. For the next few days, I waited for the fallout. I expected more angry calls, more guilt trips, maybe even a visit from my dad demanding money in person. But nothing came. It was as if my refusal had stunned him into silence. And honestly, I was glad. I needed the space. I continued to focus on my career, throwing myself into work more than ever. The promotion had come with more responsibility, and while the pressure was intense, I thrived under it. I was making a name for myself in the company, and with every project I completed, I felt more secure in my success. I had earned this. No one had handed me anything, and no one was going to take it away from me. My mom called me a few times during those weeks, but the conversations were brief and strained. I could tell she was caught between wanting to protect me and wanting to defend my dad, but I didn't blame her. She had always been stuck in the middle of his messes, just like me. As for my dad, I didn't hear from him again. Not directly, anyway. My mom told me that they were still living in motels, trying to figure out what to do next. The debt was crushing, and they had few options left. But even so, my dad refused to admit that he had made a mistake. He still blamed me for not bailing them out, for abandoning them when they needed help. But I had made my decision. I wasn't going to let my dad guilt me into giving him money. I had worked too hard to build my own life, and I wasn't going to throw it all away for someone who had never put me first. So I focused on my career, on my future, and on building a life that was mine. A life that couldn't be taken away by anyone else's bad decisions. And as for my dad, he would have to live with the consequences of his actions, just like the rest of us. After my confrontation with my dad, life settled into a strange rhythm. I was doing well at work, earning more respect and recognition every day, but the tension with my family still weighed heavily on me. My mom called occasionally, but I had all but cut off contact with my dad. He had demanded money from me, tried to guilt me into bailing him out for the financial ruin he had caused, and I refused. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the question that had been haunting me for years. Why was my dad so obsessed with Mason? It didn't make sense. His loyalty to Mason had destroyed everything, including our relationship. He had sacrificed my future for Mason's, invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in his reckless schemes, and even risked our home. And for what? What was it about Mason that made my dad willing to throw everything away? I needed answers. One evening, after yet another promotion at work, I decided to visit my mom. I hadn't seen her in months, but I felt like I needed closure. If there was anyone who could help me make sense of this, it was her. She had always been caught in the middle of my dad's obsession with Mason, and I was starting to think that maybe she knew more than she had let on. When I arrived at the dingy motel where my parents had been living, I found my mom sitting outside on a plastic chair, staring off into the distance. She looked tired, older than I remembered. The weight of the past few years had clearly taken its toll on her, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. "Mom," I said quietly, stepping toward her. She looked up, surprised to see me, and a faint smile crossed her lips. "Olivia, it's good to see you." We sat down together, the hum of traffic in the background, and for a while, neither of us said anything. I wasn't sure how to start this conversation, how to ask the questions that had been gnawing at me for so long. But I knew I couldn't leave without the truth. "Mom, I need to know something," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Why does Dad care so much about Mason? Why did he throw away everything for him?" My mom's expression tightened, and for a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting nervously, and I could tell there was something she didn't want to say. But I wasn't going to let her avoid it. "Please," I pressed. "I need to understand." She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Olivia, I've wanted to tell you for so long, but your father, he made me promise to keep quiet. He threatened me." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Threatened you? What are you talking about?" My mom's eyes filled with tears, and she took a deep breath before finally speaking the words that would change everything. "Mason is your brother." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. I stared at her, unable to process what she had just said. "Mason is my brother?" The words echoed in my mind, but they didn't make any sense. What do you mean?" I stammered, my heart pounding. "It happened before you were born," my mom whispered, her voice trembling. "Your father had an affair with Lucas's wife, back when you were just a baby. Mason is the result of that affair. Lucas never found out, but your father has always felt responsible for him. He's tried to make up for it ever since." I couldn't breathe. My father, the man who had betrayed me over and over again, had been hiding this secret from me my entire life. Mason wasn't just some family friend's son. He was my brother. And my dad had sacrificed everything for him because of the guilt he carried from his affair. "How could you keep this from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "You let me go through all of this, wondering why he cared more about Mason than me, and all this time. He was my brother? I didn't have a choice," my mom said, tears streaming down her face. "Your father threatened me. He said if I ever told anyone the truth, he would leave us with nothing. I didn't know what else to do." "I'm so sorry, Olivia." I stood up, feeling sick to my stomach. My whole life had been built on lies. My father had neglected me, betrayed me, and for what? To protect a secret that should have never been kept in the first place. But now, I knew what I had to do. A week later, everything came crashing down. Mason had resurfaced after disappearing for months, but things weren't looking good for him. He had been caught up in some shady dealings, using cryptocurrency to cover up illegal activities, and he had finally been arrested. I heard through my mom that Lucas had a heart attack when he found out. The truth about Mason had come out, the failed investments, the debts, the criminal activities, and it had pushed Lucas over the edge. I knew this was my moment. I couldn't let my father get away with what he had done, lying to me, to Lucas, and to everyone else. He had manipulated our family, stolen my future, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. I called Lucas's wife, the woman who had raised Mason as her son, and told her everything. I told her about the affair. I told her that Mason wasn't Lucas's biological child, that he was the result of my father's betrayal. I told her about how my father had been funneling money to Mason, trying to cover up his guilt, and how it had destroyed our family in the process. Her reaction was one of shock and devastation. I could hear the pain in her voice as the truth finally came out. It was clear that her world, like mine, had been built on lies, and now it was crumbling around her. But I didn't care. This was my revenge. My father had ruined my life, and now I was going to ruin his. In the days that followed, everything unraveled. Mason was sentenced to prison for his crimes, and Lucas's wife filed for divorce, unable to forgive the years of deception. Lucas, recovering from his heart attack, was left with nothing. No family, no money, no legacy. And as for my father, he was broken. The truth had come out, and he couldn't hide behind his lies anymore. He had lost everything: his family, his reputation, and the respect of the people he had once cared about. I confronted him one last time, standing in the doorway of the motel room where he and my mom were still living. "I know everything," I said coldly. "I know about Mason. I know about the affair. I know about all the lies." He didn't say anything. He just stared at me, hollow and defeated. "I hope it was worth it," I said, my voice icy. "Because now, you've lost me too." With that, I walked away, cutting both of them out of my life forever. My mom had been complicit in the lies, and as much as it hurt, I couldn't forgive her either. I needed to move on, to free myself from the toxicity of my family and build a future that was entirely my own. I had been betrayed, lied to, and neglected. But now, I was free. Free to live my life on my own terms, without the weight of my family's secrets dragging me down. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally in control of my own destiny. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.